Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus. Call me Noctis. And today we are turning 2 of the 4 elements into human characters. The other 2 will be coming very shortly after these, but in another video. Mainly for time purposes, so that this video doesn't end up being 2 hours long. But to begin with all of this, we are opening with Fire and Water. A lovely opposing duo that I've kind of done before in the past for fun and on my own time. But it is something I will undoubtedly often revisit whenever I sort of just want to enjoy myself and mess around a little. Which is how this duo has happened today. So without further ado, let's get into the fun parts of this video. Does anyone else have a favourite element? I know my friends do, whether it's from a visual aspect or the presentation of an element in other forms. But does anybody else? I mean, I know I do. Which brings us swiftly into the first up out of the 4 that we will be visiting in this series. Fire. My personal favourite element, and kindly, drawing done so far, even though I've only done 2 at this point. That isn't to say that I don't like the others, but this one just ended up being my favourite at the moment. Now, off the bat, did I consider putting them in a full snowsuit for a while since I thought it funny? Yes, I absolutely did. I have some early sketches in my sketchbook where I actually considered only that for about half an hour or so, as my other ideas just weren't functioning properly, and these range from snowsuits to puffy coats and mountains of blankets. All stuff far from a flame. The first full sketch of Fire, in air quotations, had been someone in a snowsuit as if they were going off skiing. The second sketch then had featured almost a swimsuit sort of look, as if they'd been on a beach, just to do a complete change in my ideas. Yet, I could proudly say that these were a little more on track than my starting point. Emphasis there on how they were a little bit on track, since the ideas were still not quite right. Safe to say that neither were a route I really took much further at that point. Instead beginning to make slow moves towards different dresses, skirts, shorts, until we got to the final look. Though the clothing items were things I developed separately, some as sets, yet more focused on designing cool clothes that I could potentially take somewhere. But it is safe to say that I wanted Fire to be a character dressed for warmer weather, all things considered, someplace hot and more appropriate for them. It made a little more sense to me that they'd live somewhere to match the heat of their element, and general temperature, which meant I considered a few tropical locations, a few desert locations, and all sorts of inspirations before kind of ending up with the sketch that you see. Otherwise, one of my earlier decisions I had made for Fire had been that they were a higher energy element. Something with movement or a presence others would have to note. This is mainly due to the element itself. I mean, a fire is noticed in both heat and its light, often also the smoke it produces, but looking more at the flame itself here. A flame can be small, something subtle. Yet a fire is really infamous when it is out of control, something large with its light and the heat that they burn at. In that sense, Fire's personality was a fun aspect to work out, since, even though it may not come up in the script, with stuff like this I often assign a sort of personality to a theme, to then build off of it. Fire, in the world, is something with 2 sides, like many things, and this is something I have subtly touched on already. There is the side more commonly tied into it of destruction and danger. It's an element in this aspect that destroys all in its path without regard for what is lost. This side is sort of why we see fires being used as a comparison for things like anger and temper. Usually a short one, but also more explosive and larger examples of these things. I mean, fiery tempers are a common comparison for people quick to change their tone, or for those who get angry rather quickly. Though it is interesting to me how a fiery person is simply someone passionate in their manners. something that I would say stems from the other side of a flame. The other side of fire is then of its use, a controlled aspect or something smaller that can serve a purpose and has throughout history in a variety of manners. People can cook over a flame and keep warm if they wish to. It's like can offer protection and even be used in various festivities and entertainment. The celebration aspect covers a lot too, from fireworks to entertainment forms like dancing or juggling. All things meant to awe and entertain. Also, to think of how we use it today, candles. Something small and controlled with the potential to grow beyond control and go wrong, yet more commonly used as an accent and decoration with the bonus of just smelling nice when burnt. Though in all of these uses, the fire is still a flame. The only difference between them and the first set of examples is that the second flames are controlled or contained, something we can manage and prevent from causing harm. Any flame can go wrong, even if by accident. So this all led to me wanting to create a more confident character. Someone who looked as if they were passionate and energised without being quick to back down if challenged. And I did consider maybe trying to use the opposite for a change. To take a twist on it and look at the calmer side of a flame that people can use and appreciate. Though this time I didn't have any ideas for that side of the flame. And there are some lower energy elements already that will be coming up. So it wasn't something I felt like I should have been forcing, and I really had no need to force it either. Maybe in the future I will revisit it. Who knows at this moment? But for now the character is one to appear confident and spirited, passionate in what they do. With all of that out of the way, let's move into the character details, since I have had some fun with this one. And the others. But a small confession here. These were originally meant to be rather simple characters. I wasn't planning on adding every small detail to fire that I ended up including. Things such as the belts and the patterns on the skirt. But I kind of just got into working on stuff and decided that, sure, why not? Nothing was stopping me and it did no harm. It just made the video a bit longer. Plus, I had ideas already for water that would be smaller details. More on that though later. We're saving that for their section. Now, I am glad I chose to add the details, even if I didn't include all of them I originally intended. I mean, I considered putting a gradient on the top or a more noticed pattern. Both choices I ended up deciding against though for the sake of the character, and to be honest, the others coming up since I do want them all to have the same level of detail and attention. With that said, the skirt is really the first thing I decided on fully with this character. And I sort of want to walk through the process for it since it was a series of experiments and different ideas being tied together. It began with the basic skirt, something with a split in it since I figured it would do well to convey the whole warm temperature thing. And that was something I saw in references, yet really only began to consider when I found one of my own skirts with this, that I wear for summers. I don't know why it only clicked that I could do that when I saw it in person, but sometimes it just so happens that way. Anyway, this skirt was then going to have the gradient of the flame where it would go from red to orange to yellow. The debate there was whether to begin at red at the waist or to begin with red at the floor. At this point, I was still debating what sort of top I would be including for the character. Whether it was one like in the final sketch, or something off the shoulder, or something that I'd drawn in my sketchbook and I'm forgetting at the moment. Yet most of the other options included the same details of tiny flames and colours of the skirt. So I reconsidered the skirt to a degree. I still wanted the three-tone element, this being something I was set on. So I began to doodle other ideas. One then was a red base where the orange and yellow were sheer material, layers of varying heights and detail that still followed the motion of a flame. And I did consider this for a long time. Probably until I was actually sketching the figure. I then realised that the idea had been used for another character in this set, and that there were other options I could take for fire as it stood. The solution was then simple in a sense. Make all the layers the same length and opaque. I still have the colours in them, yet the splits in the fabric allows the tones below to be seen, especially with the movement, which is sort of similar to a flame with how the colours shift and move. I sort of end up modelling it after a wrap skirt, very, very vaguely. In my mind, there is the base red skirt with the split, and then the other two are sections that could be tied and wrapped as optional layers, something removable in the case that it gets too warm wherever fire is. The belt then over top hiding these imaginary ties. All this meant is that I changed the top I was going with. I went with the options seen instead of the one with flowing sleeves or a wrapped fabric too, which I did consider. In the end, even though I couldn't say exactly where the inspiration is from, it is more from a range of places. I keep Googling different things whilst writing this script to see if maybe I could pin down where I've seen this sort of design before. Yet each search is cementing the drawn from various sources as a theory. All being said, I finished it off with details of stylised flame and fire, whilst trying not to push it too far. But let's move on. There were a few debates I had with our first figure. For starters, her hair. I don't really show it in the video, but it did give me a few minor issues here and there, with my initial idea versus how it ended up. See, I almost considered taking inspiration from a candle for it. Early ideas see the hair raising into a point of a candle's flame. One of these small and contained occurrences for fire to draw inspiration from that. I actually kept it right until the final version of the digital sketch, to be honest. That's where I simply changed my mind. I felt that it didn't quite fit for this character, and that I have seen the fire hair idea many places before. And I mean a lot of places before. So why repeat it? Why make myself repeat it when I wasn't fully committed to it? And it didn't look right anyway. I mean, it meant moving the entire figure down on the page to account for their new height, or to make the entire figure smaller. A choice I already didn't want to do after having to cut off the feet from the earlier sketches. See, one day I will draw a full person in one of these videos, but today is not that day. So then I considered a few other avenues. The first I considered was to make the hair lava, flowing with rocks and the magma. That quickly got scrapped. The skirt already demands a lot of attention, and lava ties into other elements and sort of steps on a few toes, for lacking better words. It then went into an updo, something tied back, and again that didn't quite fit. The hair instead ends up as is seen here. Something short so that it doesn't conflict too much, and yet something that has more of a presence that moves the skirt in many ways. I also preferred the gradient, to be fair, an idea that had been considered for everything else at this point and denied. Though the length doesn't conflict with anything else in the piece, so the colours didn't matter too much. The length doesn't conflict with anything else in the piece. It doesn't overlap, and the gradient complements rather than distracts. And it was the right solution for me. It was a good middle ground. Then the second of my debates had been the fire in her hand. Now I usually do quite stylised flame or cartoonish fire. The sort of thing seen in different parts of the design, like the belt and at the end of the pendants on the waist. This section, the fire in her hand, is something that I do finish off camera, so stick around for the results at the end. Yet this time I opted for something far looser than I would often favour, and almost something closer to how I would approach leaves and more plant-like items. And I'll be honest, I wasn't sure about it at first. I fully chose to ignore it until the end of the image, since I really had no clue what I would do with it, and wanted time to think. By the time I finish it, I am rather happy with the outcome of it, all things considered. It's different, not my normal comfort zone, and yet it ends up tying the image together fairly well. Despite the trouble that the hands gave me too. That is debate 3. Another I took off camera in the middle of the flat processes, since I was not giving myself another 5 minutes of sped up footage just trying to work out the hands. It's also the reason the video starts off with the skin already blocked in. The first clip ended up rather short before I started having these difficulties, so it made very little difference to leave it out. Though again, I am happy with the end result. It simply took an extra 5 sketches to get there is all. And I doubt I am alone in saying that hands are one of my struggling points. They have been for years, and I have sketchbook pages filled with nothing but. Some where I think I finally understand them, only for the next to return to square one. It doesn't really bother me anymore. It used to quite a bit. The hands are now something that I know to give myself extra time with, and if I get tired of them, stick them in a pocket or something. It always works. Or step away and come back later. Depends what mood I'm in. They were really my only challenges for this section though. As I touched on earlier, a lot of the flats were me deciding that things need extra details, and that I could include things here and there. Things that were never in this first sketch to begin with, yet help just finish it off. I definitely wouldn't like fire as much as I do without these details, so they all paid off in the end. And I considered more. I almost considered adding singed edges to the element's skirt, yet chose against things like that. Now, I have a couple of minutes left before we can wrap up this section and move on to cover water and really begin to expand on their ideas. So, since this is a little part I'm adding on later, I have realised I just finished the eyes and never made mention of them earlier in the script, and I simply can't allow that. They're one of my favourite details. See, Fire's hair was originally meant to hold the element. I've already touched on all of that. And that is something that I do give to another element very soon, and I am considering if I'm going to do it for the remaining 2. There's a few that I might and a few that I might not. Yet, as I've already touched on, I did take that detail out of the design. Though then I realised I still wanted some sort of tie into the physical element in their person, not just in the outfit. So I added the little flames to the eyes instead of a pupil, and personally just adore that detail. It's just one of those details I didn't originally plan, like half of them, yet felt like adding since it was sort of cute and still stands out when I'm not zooming in on the face. And even then I only say cute because I can't think of a better way to describe it. That is sort of a pattern with me. The pupil is one of my favourite unplanned details if I had to pick one. So I felt like I had to mention them at this point since I forgot to sooner. And yes, I know I was just saying about things that I didn't add, but I felt like we should wrap up Fire on a positive note, rather than focusing on what could have been and what should have been in and what I didn't end up adding. It's also one of those details that may come up once more when we get to water. Though we'll have to see now, won't we? Though with all of that being said, that brings us to the end of the section. So let's welcome in the next. Now, the saying is fire and ice, but today we have fire and water. The same in spirit, yet different in word. So, water. I will be honest here when I say that they were the element I had the least ideas for in the early stage. But I knew I wanted to start with fire, so I got to thinking and brainstorming. The main delay to drawing these and doing these videos had actually been water, thanks to the early ideas and simply how stuck I felt with it all. I mean, I wasn't too sure what to do. I could have gone in a beach direction, but that didn't feel quite right. Yes, beaches have an ocean, and the water in that manner yet it also includes sand and hot temperatures, something I had already been working on with fire. And I know, I didn't go down that route with fire either, but the few sketches I had made already meant I hadn't really been too enthusiastic to repeat it all with water again, when I don't think of the beach with that element. The ocean, yes, but not the image of a beach. I mean, beaches can be made of rock too, which would tie close to earth in my mind of all things. Perhaps I'm simply strange in that sense. The beach itself is the sand or the rocks. The ocean is then the water, and even then I prefer to explore themes of the depths and the layers of the ocean, as that is the spirit of the element. It's your rivers, your streams, your oceans and storms. It's the bodies of water and the depths that people explore and discover that is really the fun of the element that I wanted to explore in this sense. Now, in terms of the element's view and use, we need it to live. It's a non-negotiable part of life that you need to consume water in order to live. Otherwise, it's also used as fun in a sense of these larger bodies. I mean, you can play in the ocean, swim in lakes. Lakes and rivers can also be used for fishing and a long list of water activities. We also have swimming pools that can serve a similar purpose for sports and recreation. All of this sort of working to give water a more positive connection. Though it too has a cruel side. Storms, tsunamis, even seemingly innocent bodies of water can be dangerous with currents. Not to mention the ocean. It is deep. Very deep. Which can often spark a fear of it for many people. Also, in the ocean, you have nothing around if something goes wrong. Again, aiding why some people may fear it. Ironically, both of these are also why it draws people's attention. Though, unlike fire, it is more commonly seen for the serene side and the kind aspect of it. Storms can be feared, mainly with the power that some can carry, and yet rain on its own comes to be calming. It is interesting how similar it is to fire in that respect. A single element with two sides and many factors contributing to the overall impression that it can create. So, since I took fire down the route I did, giving them the stronger personality, I chose to let water be calmer. Someone who seemed kinder in some sense, more welcoming. And I did consider going down the bubbly route, purely for the pun. And yet that personality ties in a little more to another element, ironically. I seriously had to talk myself out of doing the same for both elements though, but the pun was present for a fair while. In the end, personality-wise, I chose this route since I've never really been afraid of the water or the ocean. I have had friends who are, yet never have been myself. Instead, the depths are interesting with what we know. It's always been something I want to learn more about, yet keep forgetting to research in all honesty. But let's move on at this point to the actual character itself. The first detail of the character I want to address is, yet again, their skirt. Only because it ties into fire a little. See, I mentioned earlier that fire could have had a sheer version of their skirt, and something with the see-through layers that fit a flame. Yet that idea had already been taken by water, and it simply was too good to take from them. And I did have other options that I found fun, but this one was simply too fun. So the earlier version of the skirt was something closer to a swimsuit cover. A shorter skirt wrapped, like for the beach, over some shorts. A branch that did come from fire. Yet then I got the idea of ocean layers, and what is more water than the ocean? The only issue I took with the skirt in the end is that the 4 layers didn't work or look right, making it one short of the ocean's actual layers. Instead, I managed the 3 and counted the underskirt as the 4th. But that still ends up being one short, It's a little better though. Maybe count the hair as the top layer? That might be a bit of a stretch. Anyway, the layers on the skirt are meant to be representations of the layers in the ocean for the various depths, each one being a different depth since it is a core part of the element. I then added the yellow dots on the lowest, mainly as a little nod to the sand at the bottom of it all, and also the beach. Just because I don't think of beaches for the element doesn't mean that nobody does. So I thought it could be nice to include a small nod to it. Just nothing that would be a key element. Now, this idea had been quite an early one too. Most of the consideration had been more focused on how I would layer them. I could have done something similar to fire, having them all wrap around them in some sort of belt with a split somewhere on them. Layered so that the fabric each covers the entire skirt, if that makes any sense. I instead chose to have them as seen, where each layer is longer than that above it. The latter method just worked better, in my opinion. See, it ties into another aspect of water I was trying to include, that being water's transparency. A lot of water you can see through it and see the bottom. Maybe not clearly, but you could make out a rock or a fish below the surface. Then you have those lakes and such with clear water where the bottom is on display, and they are rather cool to look at too. Yet the deeper the water, more often than not, the less you see. I mean, the ocean. Looking down into it, you can see the bottom in the shallow sections, yet at the deepest there is no chance. Plus there are situations with swamps and some ponds where you can't see far below the surface despite how shallow it is. Not to mention with things like canals, rivers and puddles where you can't be 100% certain how deep it is at all times. So the fabric sort of mimics this. The skirt below is hard to make out, the shading on it actually looks rather silly without the layers above. Yet the bottom layer is more visible than those near the top, since the top section has each of the layers making it more opaque, despite it still showing the smallest bit of detail from the skirt below. It's something I have played with before in other characters, yet came to love with this one. The second detail I then want to address is the accents like the bracelets and the necklaces. I made a lot of the fire's decorations gold to match the yellow of the flame, and it is more of a gold element. Red and gold or red and yellow is just a good palette really. Yet water is more of a silver. Well, silver and pearls. The round sections were meant to read as pearls, but that depends on how people see it. I do think they end out looking like pearls, but it was my first time doing them, so who knows, I may be a little bit biased in that respect. Anyway, the decorations. I had a lot of fun with them, especially around the belt since those details were some less planned. The pearl is intended, yet only meant to be single threads connected. I naturally decided to connect more together though, which I think works as a point of detail, especially considering that the colour matches the lace details by the sleeves and such. All of them ended out being something simple and small, to add to it rather than take away. I then kept employing the strategy of adding lines and connections until I was happy or bored of that detail. It was also done to match the white on the top of the dress, those being a pattern I used in another drawing on the channel that I really liked, so chose to include here as well, since it looks like the top of the water sometimes. All in all, it is something that worked out well in the end as a way of giving the character another tie to the element of water, without accidentally making them embody the ocean or whatever. Being said, let's move into the details that offered a fair challenge. The first of these being the hair. It was a challenge in the sense that it was the main detail of the figure, the aspect trying to firmly tie them into the element they represent. Yet I wasn't sure how to really go about it. In that, I mean I wasn't sure if I went and made it look closer to hair, or went all in on the water aspect. and if I went all in on the water aspect, how I would exactly do that. I don't draw water often, something I have admitted before. So if I made it her hair, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to look like a lake, an ocean, or perhaps even a waterfall. I considered the final option for a while in the sketching phase, yet I knew I sort of wanted it to be more stylised. So I'll then admit that the shading was something I made up as I went. At one point, I went full in on the water. Another moment, I had undone all of that and instead made it more of a middle ground between the hair and water. That design didn't quite look right though, since the top half made the bottom seem unfinished in a sense. It got to a point where I mixed around 5 different attempts that ended up with the finished result. Even then sending it to someone for feedback that it was alright and I wasn't just telling myself it had to be done with. I mean, in the moment I was happy with it, but wasn't convinced. Looking back when writing the script, since I have the drawing at my side, I can't exactly see why I was so unhappy with it. I now feel that if I had done much more, I would have risked ruining the character. It would have been too much, especially when put in context with the rest of the character and the rest of the set. Now, the second challenge I had is another I took off camera once I finished the flats. See, I did the face as I normally would, and it didn't sit quite right. You'll see how many times I redo the circle meant to be the iris. It definitely gives me a challenge. And yet I do repeat the process off camera since the face didn't sit right. It is another area that is hard to put into words, yet I finished the flats and stopped recording before I found the face funny more than anything. Putting it really down to the eyes, since I think the original ended up a little bit too wide, if that's how I can word it. And yes, the changes made are rather subtle, but it was enough that it improved the face for me. Mainly simply making the iris smaller and shifting it slightly to the side to make them look in the same direction a bit more too. Whilst I'm talking about this, I also considered the eye colour for a while too. More off camera. But the character themselves are very blue. There is a lot of it with the purple accent, and yet water characters commonly have blue eyes to tie into the element as a little nod. Something subtle most people don't notice. However, you'll notice that I don't do this. First of all, the blue eyes didn't fit. I tried them and it didn't fit. There was too much blue at that point. Also, I kind of knew I didn't want them to be blue, even if I considered and tried it when making the piece. However, I very quickly went with the darker tone. The first reason for this is that it worked as a nice point of contrast to the rest of the blue, and it ties into the depths of the ocean fairly well. A small nod and something a little different against what I keep seeing in all different places. The second reason for the darker tone is that it did tie in the purple that little bit more as well, making it more tied into the character. After all of the subtle changes, it gave me no further issues, and I'm rather happy to say that. Now, like with Fire, I have a little bit of time left before we wrap up, just to kind of waffle about details I couldn't slip in sooner. Like with this one, I'd also looked at inspirations from mermaids and other creatures tied to the sea and the ocean. Even things like sharks, dolphins, and so on, a few seals even. There were a few cute ideas that came along with this too, especially ones from the animals, since I may have ended up picking my favourite ocean animals to draw from in the end. Yet I then kind of decided on the dress as a feature before really unpacking and going down this avenue, and looking at everything to do with these ties in that much detail. Though, to be fair, this is also because I knew I didn't want to go far down the animal or myth route. I do want all of the elements to look closer to human rather than animal, and if I'd made this one a mermaid, then it would have been less likely to read as the element of water, or even a character based on water. Giving her a tail would have pulled it towards another mermaid design, since they are often based on the ocean they live in. So yeah, she would have had a water theme, but not really have been the element of water that I had been aiming for. It also would have been strange to me if she was the only one with a tail, or other associated details with animals. Like, it would have just broken up the set in a sense, and in a way that I couldn't explain away to myself either. Because visually she would kind of stick out a bit too much. Though that isn't to say that I completely wrote it off. There were some things that I considered that were as small as gills, even if I had made the pattern look more like a tattoo on their neck, yet chose against it in the long run, mainly with the necklaces and the pearls already added in that area. After all, if I had added the animal details, it then risked looking more like I'd based the design off some sea creature. An idea for the future, maybe, turning sea creatures into humans. But that wasn't really what I was going for today. So with all of that said, we are coming up on the end of the video here. I had hoped that a certain thing I'm working on would be ready to mention at this point, but it seems that I may have to wait for the second part of the Elements video. Oh well, I guess it gives us something to look forward to. Being said, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the characters. So far, I have been referring to each of them as their element, but if people have any name ideas for them, I would love to hear it. Now, I hope you have a wonderful day and that you join me in the future. Goodbye!